It's 7:30 in the morning on Wednesday, September 21st, 1938, and Westerly, Rhode Island is coming alive. The air is warm, almost summery, unusually so for the third week of September. The smell of bacon drifts from kitchen windows on High Street. Church bells are ringing the half hour at Christchurch. Down at the waterfront, fishermen are mending nets and grumbling about the rain that has been falling, off and on, for 4 straight days. On Pawcatuck Avenue, a school bus driver named Norman Caswell is fueling his bus for the morning route. He is 33 years old, married, well-liked. The route runs from the seaside hamlets of Watch Hill and Misquamicut into Westerly proper, 6 miles of low coastal road that floods in heavy rain. He has driven it for years. Today the radio said the rain might pick up later, so the children are going to school early. Norman waves to a neighbour. He climbs into the bus. He sets out for the first pickup. A milkman finishes his last delivery. A streetcar rattles past the post office. Out on Nappertree Point, a few summer families are still in their cottages, packing slowly, hoping for one last warm afternoon at the beach before closing the houses for the season. This is ordinary life, unremarkable, forgettable, the kind of morning no one would ever think to remember. By 4 o'clock this afternoon, Norman Caswell's school bus will be at the bottom of the Westerly marshes, and most of the children inside it will be dead. The Nappertree cottages, every single one of them, will be gone. Westerly's downtown will be under 12 feet of water, and before the sun sets on New England, more than 680 people will be dead, 8,900 homes destroyed, and entire coastal villages erased from the map. In less than 7 hours, the Atlantic Ocean will rise up and swallow southern New England whole. To understand what happened on September 21st, you first need to understand the shape of southern New England, and why that shape made it a death trap. Picture the coastline of the United States from New Jersey to Maine. It runs more or less straight northeast until it gets to Long Island. There the land bends, New York's south shore juts out, and behind it, the southern coasts of Connecticut and Rhode Island form a long, shallow bowl that opens directly to the sea. Look closer. Between Watch Hill, Rhode Island and Newport, the coastline curves inward like a catcher's mitt, and in the middle of that mitt is the mouth of Narragansett Bay. Now follow Narragansett Bay north. It narrows, it funnels. 28 miles of salt water compressed between 2 granite shores, ending at the city of Providence. A city built on tidal flats at the bay's narrowest point, where 3 rivers meet the sea. This is what coastal engineers call a perfect storm surge amplifier. Any wall of water pushed into the open mouth of the bay has nowhere to go but up. By the time it reaches Providence, the surge is doubled, sometimes tripled. To the east, Buzzards Bay does the same thing for New Bedford. To the west, the Connecticut shoreline catches the surge head-on. And just offshore, invisible until it kills you, sits the continental shelf, shallow and gradual, the kind of bottom that lifts a storm tide higher and higher as it approaches the beach. Beautiful, yes. Sailors had loved this coast for 3 centuries, but beautiful also meant exposed. It meant funneled. It meant that whatever the Atlantic threw at southern New England, the geography would amplify before letting it ashore. And by the morning of September 21st, the Atlantic had thrown something nobody alive in Rhode Island had ever seen. 8 days earlier, on September 13th, 1938, a tropical wave drifted off the African coast near the Cape Verde Islands. By September 16th, it was a hurricane. By the 19th, it was a Category 5 with sustained winds of 160 miles per hour, churning west toward the Bahamas. It was, by every measurement available, a monster. The eye was 40 miles wide. The wind field stretched across 600 miles of ocean. A single rotating storm system larger than the entire state of Texas. Pressure at its centre dropped to 941 millibars. By the time it reached the latitude of Florida, it was the most powerful Atlantic hurricane in living memory. But it didn't hit Florida. On September 20th, the storm began to curve. It picked up speed, extraordinary speed. By the morning of the 21st, it was moving northeast at over 60 miles per hour. For comparison, an average hurricane moves at 10 to 15 miles per hour. This one was sprinting up the coast at the velocity of a freight train, riding a powerful jet stream that aimed it like a bullet. It would later be nicknamed the Long Island Express. 600 miles of open ocean covered in roughly 12 hours. There would be no time to prepare. There would barely be time to look up. And here is the part that should have set off every alarm bell in the US Weather Bureau. Hurricanes that fast, that intense, do not lose strength quickly. They have no time to. By the time the Long Island Express reached the latitude of New York, it would still be a strong Category 3, a 120-mile-per-hour wall of wind, water, and pressure-bombed ocean. And it would be heading straight into the catcher's mitt of southern New England. Nobody up there expected it. New England, the conventional wisdom went, did not get hurricanes. The shallow waters of the mid-Atlantic broke them up. The cold currents north of Cape Hatteras sapped them. There had not been a major hurricane to strike New England since 1815, 123 years earlier, before anyone alive could remember. As one Boston editor would write that very week, hurricanes were a Florida problem. New England, he assured his readers, was immune. Immune. That word would haunt the US Weather Bureau for the next 80 years. There was one man, in a small office in Washington, D.C., who knew exactly what was about to happen. His name was Charles C. Pierce. Pierce was 28 years old, a junior forecaster at the US Weather Bureau headquarters. On the morning of September 21st, he was the only meteorologist in the entire United States government who correctly read the storm's path. While his superiors gathered around the synoptic charts, Pierce traced the high-pressure ridge over the Atlantic, plotted the storm's accelerating forward motion, and saw the future in clean, unmistakable lines. The storm wasn't going to curve safely out to sea. The high-pressure ridge to the east was acting as a wall. The hurricane was being funneled. It was heading directly for southern New England. He told them. He showed them his charts. He said the words out loud. This storm will strike Long Island and New England this afternoon. He was overruled. The senior forecasters, Charles Mitchell, the Bureau's chief, and the regional staff above Pierce, refused to believe him. Their reasoning was simple and devastating. It had not happened in their lifetime, therefore it would not happen now. Hurricanes did not strike New England. The official 11:30 a.m. forecast issued by the Bureau warned only of a tropical disturbance off the coast of Virginia, with gale-force winds possible from New York northward. There was no hurricane warning. There was no evacuation order. There was no command to clear the beaches. There was time. There was always time. The Bureau had radio. The Bureau had teletype. The Bureau had the US Coast Guard, the New York City Police, every newspaper in New England waiting on a word from Washington. The word never came. A junior forecaster begged. The Weather Bureau ignored him. He begged again. The Bureau did nothing. Charles Pierce sat at his desk in Washington as the morning ticked toward noon, watching the dot on his chart cross the latitude of New Jersey at 60 miles an hour, knowing exactly what was about to die. Up in Westerly, Norman Caswell finished his morning route. The radio played dance music. The clouds began to lower. Out at Napatree Point, the cottagers noticed that the surf seemed strange. The waves were coming in faster than the wind should have been pushing them. They didn't know what that meant. Nobody had told them. Pierce was right. His superiors were wrong. And the people of southern New England, and the fishermen in New London, the school children in Westerly, the mill workers in Pawcatuck, the cottagers at Napatree, were going to pay for that decision in lives. By 11 a.m. on September 21st, the surf at West Hampton Beach, Long Island, was running 30 feet high. By 12:30, it was breaking over the dunes. Children playing on the sand watched the water surge up to their cottages, then past them. Some thought it was a fascinating storm. A few of them ran inland. Most stood and watched. At 2:30 p.m, the eye of the hurricane made landfall on Long Island near Bayport. The pressure was so low that residents felt their ears pop. Buildings imploded. The wall of wind on the backside of the eye gusted to 160 miles per hour. In a span of 45 minutes, the western half of West Hampton Beach was reduced to floating debris. 179 houses there would be destroyed. 29 people would die before the storm even crossed Long Island Sound. It crossed in less than an hour. The Long Island Express ploughed across the Sound at 60 miles per hour, dragging a storm surge 16 feet high. At 3:40 p.m, it slammed into the Connecticut shore at Old Saybrook. At 4 p.m, it was hitting Watch Hill, Rhode Island. At 4:15, it was over Westerly. At 4:30, the hurricane's full Category 3 force was driving up Narragansett Bay toward the city of Providence. On Block Island, the wind smashed the Coast Guard anemometer at 121 miles per hour before the instrument was torn from its post. At Blue Hill Observatory in Massachusetts, a 5-minute sustained wind of 121 miles per hour was recorded, with a peak gust of 186. These numbers would not be exceeded by any New England weather event in the next century. But the wind was not the killer. The wind was just the messenger. The killer was the wall of water the wind was pushing. A 14 to 17-foot storm surge, travelling at the speed of an automobile, rising out of the Atlantic with no announcement and no mercy. By the time the Westerly fire chief picked up the telephone to call for help, the line was dead. By the time the Providence harbour master looked out his window, the harbour was rising at the rate of a foot every 2 minutes. The people in the path had less than 30 minutes warning. Most of them had no warning at all. The hurricane didn't approach New England. It exploded onto it. At West Hampton, Long Island, the surge took the dune cottages first. Whole houses lifted off their foundations and sailed inland on a tide of seawater. A Coast Guardsman watching from his station saw a 2-story home pass his window, intact, with 2 people clinging to the roof. 29 residents and visitors of West Hampton Beach died in less than an hour. 10 of them were never found. At Stonington, Connecticut, a passenger train called the Bostonian was halted on the tracks by a wall of water. The conductor uncoupled the engine and pushed the cars one by one through the surge until the train reached higher ground. Most aboard survived. Behind it, the village of Stonington's downtown was already flooding. Boats from the harbour were drifting through Main Street. At Watch Hill, Rhode Island, a 30-foot fishing trawler was lifted by the surge, carried half a mile inland, and deposited intact on the lawn of the Ocean House Hotel. The hotel itself survived. Almost everything around it did not. And then, on the low coastal road between Misquamicut and Westerly, Norman Caswell's school bus came around a bend. The bus was driving the children home early because the rain had finally turned violent. There were 7 children aboard, ranging in age from 6 to 14. Norman saw the wave coming, a wall of dark water rolling across the marsh from the south, taller than the telephone poles. He stopped the bus. He told the children to climb out and follow him toward higher ground. The water hit before they reached it. The bus was lifted off the road and carried into the marsh. Children spilled into the water and were swept apart in seconds. Norman fought the current for as long as he could, holding one girl above the surface, a 7-year-old he had just pulled from the steps of the bus, until they both caught hold of a piece of floating debris. He clung to her, and she clung to him, for 2 hours, in a marsh churning with downed trees and the wreckage of houses, until the water finally began to drop. They were the only 2 who survived. 5 of the children on Norman Caswell's bus drowned. 3 of the bodies would not be recovered for several days. 1 was never recovered at all. Out at Napatree Point and the long, thin sandbar curving west from Watch Hill into the open ocean, 15 of the 42 summer cottages were still occupied. The radios played music, the wind picked up, the water rose. When the surge hit Napatree at 4 p.m, it came as a single 15-foot wave that swept the entire sandbar from end to end. The cottages did not collapse. They simply ceased to exist, picked up bodily, broken into kindling, washed across Littleson, Narragansett Bay. Of the 42 people on Napatree Point that afternoon, only 15 survived, mostly by clinging to cottage roofs and floating across 2 miles of bay water for hours. The others were swept into the sea. The sandbar itself was scoured down to bare sand. By nightfall, Napatree's cottages were a memory. They have never been rebuilt. In Westerly proper, the surge rolled up the Pawcatuck River and burst through the downtown. The water rose 12 feet in 15 minutes. People in second-floor windows watched the first floor of their own houses fill with seawater. By 5 p.m, 100 Westerly residents were dead. But the worst was still coming. The hurricane drove north up Narragansett Bay, and at 5:15 p.m, a 13.5-foot storm tide hit downtown Providence, Rhode Island. Water poured into the financial district. The lobby of the Industrial Trust building, Providence's tallest skyscraper, flooded to the ceiling of the first floor. Streetcars stalled in the rising water, their passengers climbed onto the roofs. A carousel from a waterfront amusement park drifted up Westminster Street, riderless. By the time the surge peaked, downtown Providence was under more than 17 feet of water, but the nightmare wasn't over. It was about to get worse. As the wind died after dark, gas lines ruptured by floating debris began to ignite. Fires broke out across the flooded districts of New London, Connecticut, and Westerly, Rhode Island. There was no way to fight them. The streets were rivers, the hydrants submerged, the firehouses themselves flooded. New London burned for 10 hours through the night while the city was still underwater. When the sun rose on Thursday, September 22nd, southern New England did not look like a place that had been struck by a storm. It looked like a place that had been emptied. 682 people were confirmed dead. The true number is almost certainly higher, perhaps as high as 800. Of the confirmed dead, 99 were in Westerly, Rhode Island, and the surrounding villages. 85 were in Providence County, 63 were in New London, Connecticut. 29 were on West Hampton Beach. The rest were scattered across the Connecticut shoreline, Buzzards Bay, central Massachusetts, and Vermont, where the storm crossed the Green Mountains and continued to kill. More than 100 of the dead were children under the age of 15. 41 entire families were lost, from grandparents to infants. Every member drowned or crushed. 63 of the bodies were never identified. They were buried in unmarked graves, marked only with concrete numbers. 8,900 homes were destroyed. 15,000 were damaged. 2,600 boats were sunk in the harbours of New England. The entire commercial fishing fleet of southern New England wiped out in 3 hours. An estimated 2 billion trees were blown down across the region, a forest loss so vast that the US Forest Service organised a salvage operation that ran until 1942. They were still cutting hurricane timber when Pearl Harbor was attacked. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the WPA, and units of the US Army arrived on September 22nd to dig out survivors and recover the dead. The Red Cross set up emergency shelters in church basements from Bridgeport to Boston. Families opened their homes to neighbours who had nowhere left to live. In Watch Hill, where 42 people had stood on Nappertree Point the day before, only 15 had been pulled from the bay alive. The remaining bodies came in slowly. Over 2 days, 1 week, 2 weeks, until some never came in at all. Norman Caswell attended the funerals of the 5 children he could not save. He drove the same bus route until he retired more than 2 decades later. He never spoke publicly about September 21st. There was no trial. There was no inquiry. There was no public reckoning of any kind. Charles C. Pierce, the junior forecaster who had correctly predicted the path of the hurricane, did not speak to a reporter for nearly 40 years. His warning was not part of the official record of the disaster. His superiors at the Weather Bureau released a public statement on September 22nd, describing the storm as unprecedented and impossible to forecast. Language that protected the careers of every senior forecaster who had overruled him. Pierce kept his job. He never received a promotion related to the 1938 storm. He was not formally credited with the correct forecast until 1976, when a historian writing a book on the hurricane interviewed him at his home. By then, Charles Mitchell, the Weather Bureau chief who had killed the warning, had been dead for decades, his obituary describing a long and distinguished career in public service. The people of southern New England received no compensation. There was no federal disaster relief program in 1938. That institution would not exist for decades. The Red Cross paid for emergency shelter. The CCCC and WPA cleared the debris. Insurance, where it existed, mostly excluded acts of God. Most families simply absorbed the loss. The wealthy summer colonies along the Connecticut and Rhode Island shore rebuilt within a few years. The working-class neighbourhoods of New London and central Westerly took a decade. But things did change, slowly. The 1938 hurricane forced the Weather Bureau to overhaul its forecasting procedures. Hurricane warnings would no longer require unanimous senior agreement. By 1944, the first hurricane reconnaissance flights were in the air. The modern hurricane watch and warning system, with its named storms and colour-coded coastal alerts, traces its origin in part to the failure of September 21, 1938. The men and women of the National Hurricane Center today work in the long shadow of Charles Pierce. Drive west from Watch Hill, Rhode Island today, and you can still walk out onto Nappertree Point. There are no cottages. There has never been another cottage built there. The town of Westerly never granted a single rebuilding permit. The dune grass has come back. The beach roses have come back. The gulls and the terns have come back. But the 42 summer homes with their bright shutters and screened porches are gone forever. scattered across the bottom of Little Narragansett Bay, where the surge of September 21st sent them. The 1938 hurricane was not just a natural disaster. Nature provided the storm, but arrogance gave it the chance to kill. The Weather Bureau's senior staff knew, on the morning of September 21st, that a young forecaster named Charles Pierce was tracking a hurricane bound for New England. They chose not to believe him because they could not believe it. 682 people died for that decision. 682 people, and the Napatree summer colony, and the 5 children on a school bus in Westerly, who climbed aboard on a warm Wednesday morning while a junior meteorologist in Washington begged his bosses to pick up the phone. Remember New England. Remember that the warning is only as good as the man willing to listen.